This reading is brought to you courtesy of Respect Your Legacy Books. This excerpt is taken from The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. Tribal life was broken up and millions of detribalized Africans were let loose upon each other. The unceasing destruction of crops led to cannibalism. The captive women became concubines and degraded the status of the wife. Tribes had to supply slaves or be sold as slaves themselves. Violence and ferocity became the necessities for survival, and violence and ferocity survived. The stockades of grinning skulls, the human sacrifices, the selling of their own children as slaves, these horrors were the product of an intolerable pressure on the African peoples, which became fiercer through the centuries as the demands of industry increased and the methods of coercion were perfected. The slaves were collected in the interior, fastened one to the other in columns, loaded with heavy stones of 40 or 50 pounds in weight to prevent attempts at escape, and then marched a long journey to the sea, sometimes hundreds of miles, the weakly and sick dropping to die in the African jungle. Some were brought to the coast by canoe, lying in the bottom of the boats for days on end, their hands bound, their faces exposed to the tropical sun and the tropical rain, their backs in the water which was never bailed out. At the slave ports, they were penned into trunks for the inspection of the buyers. Night and day, thousands of human beings were packed in these dens of putrefaction, so that no European could stay in them for longer than a quarter of an hour without fainting. The Africans fainted and recovered, or fainted and died, the mortality in the trunks being over 20%. Outside in the harbor, waiting to empty the trunks as they filled, was the captain of the slave ship, with so clear a conscience that one of them, in the intervals of waiting to enrich British capitalism with the profits of another valuable cargo, enriched British religion by composing the hymn, "How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds." On the ships, the slaves were packed in the hold on galleries one above the other. Each was given only 4 or 5 feet in length and 2 or 3 feet in height, so that they could neither lie at full length nor sit upright. Contrary to the lies that have been spread so pertinaciously about Negro docility, the revolts at the port of embarkation and on board were incessant, so that the slaves had to be chained, right hand to right leg, left hand to left leg, and attached in rows to long iron bars. In this position they lived for the voyage, coming up once a day for exercise and to allow the sailors to clean the pails. But when the cargo was rebellious or the weather bad, then they stayed below for weeks at a time. The close proximity of so many naked human beings, their bruised and festering flesh, the fetid air, the prevailing dysentery, the accumulation of filth, turned these holes into a hell. During the storms, the hatches were battened down, and in close and loathsome darkness, they were hurled from one side to another by the heaving vessel, held in position by the chains on their bleeding flesh. No place on earth, observed one writer of the time, concentrated so much misery as the hold of a slave ship. Twice a day, at 9 and at 4, they received their food. To the slave traders, they were articles of trade and no more. A captain held up by calms or adverse winds was known to have poisoned his cargo. Another killed some of his slaves to feed the others with the flesh. They died not only from the regime, but from grief and rage and despair. They undertook vast hunger strikes, undid their chains and hurled themselves on the crew in futile attempts at insurrection. What could these inland tribesmen do on the open sea in a complicated sailing vessel? To brighten their spirits, it became the custom to have them up on deck once a day and force them to dance. Some took the opportunity to jump overboard, uttering cries of triumph as they cleared the vessel and disappeared below the surface. Fear of their cargo bred a savage cruelty in the crew. One captain, to strike terror into the rest, killed a slave and, dividing heart, liver, and entrails into 300 pieces, made each of the slaves eat one, threatening those who refused with the same torture. Such incidents were not rare. Given the circumstances, such things were and are inevitable. nor did the system spare the slavers. Every year, 1/5 of all who took part in the African trade died. All America and the West Indies took slaves. When the ship reached the harbor, the cargo came up on deck to be bought. The purchasers examined them for defects, looked at the teeth, pinched the skin, sometimes tasted the perspiration to see if the slave's blood was pure and his health as good as his appearance. Some of the women affected a curiosity, the indulgence of which, with a horse, would have caused them to be kicked 20 yards across the deck. But the slave had to stand it. Then, in order to restore the dignity which might have been lost by too intimate an examination, the purchaser spat in the face of the slave. Having become the property of the owner, he was branded on both sides of the breast with a hot iron. His duties were explained to him by an interpreter, and the priest instructed him in the first principles of Christianity.